Next, let's use constraints and compare them with the direct attribute connections we talked about before, as well as set-driven key. Let's see where the differences in their behaviors are. So, we can see in my scene there are three groups of models. Each has a driver object and a driven object. When we move the driver objects, the results they produce are similar. However, the methods they use are different. Let's first look at our orange group. This group, if we look at my driven object, it has a light yellow color in front of its values. This represents that these attributes have a direct connection to the driver object. And our purple group is blue in front. This means it's using set-driven key. And our blue group is light blue in front. This means it's constrained. Okay, we just moved the driver objects. The results they achieve are the same. But where is the difference? Let's take a look. Each of our driver objects has a group above it. So when we move this parent group, let's see if there's any change. We can see the constrained group still works, but our direct attribute connection and set-driven key, they no longer have any effect on our driven object. Now let's compare the driven objects. Our driven objects also each have a group above them. Let's see. When we move the driven object's parent group, is there any change? Let's select these three groups and move them. We can see the parent group still works for the attribute connection and set-driven key, but it no longer has any effect on the constraint. We've talked about the properties of constraints before. They operate based on word position. And as for why the driver object's parent group affects the driven object, and why our driven object's parent group doesn't affect it, this is something we also talk about when we look inside Maya at how constraints actually work. We mentioned it then. It's because when it's doing the constraint, it takes more attributes into consideration in the calculation. But here, attribute connection and set-driven key, their way of operating is much simpler. Their operation, simply put, is just taking the values of these specific attributes on the driver object's transform node, and when they change, passing them to the driven object's corresponding attributes. So it's a direct transfer effect between them. Set-driven key is actually the same concept. The only difference is that with set-driven key, when we pass the value from the driver object to the driven object, it goes through an extra step of its own node's calculation. But essentially, it is still just editing this one value. It's not like constraints. With constraints, it's not just editing this value. If we remember what we talk about, it considers its parent level's word matrix. So it's actually editing its word position. This makes it very easy to understand. When our parent level changes, we know that translate, rotate, scale, these values are relative to the parent level. When we move the parent object, will the values on the object itself change? Definitely not. Since there's no change, no value is being passed to the driven object. So the driven object won't have any value changes either. And when we move the driven object's parent group, similarly, when we move it, no value change is being taken into account. So here, the driven objects can still follow its own parent group, because it doesn't need to have any change in its values. But on the other hand, when we're using constraints, when we move its parent level, the reason it stays in place is because its values are producing an opposite change to allow it to stay in its original spot. So this is the biggest difference between direct attribute connection, including set-driven key, and this series of attribute control methods and constraints. Constraints consider the word position. The parent groups of the driver and driven objects are actually involved in the constraints calculation. But attribute connection, including set-driven key, have no relationship with the parent groups at all. We hope everyone pays attention to this difference. Alright, so that is our entire explanation on controlling attributes. We will, based on different needs in different situations, choose to use different methods to control our attributes, whether it's direct connection, or constraints, or set-driven key. In our future exercises, I'm sure we'll all get more and more comfortable with this. Okay, see you in the next video.